Good morning. Welcome to the virtual Peterson Institute for International Economics for today's session in our ongoing series of rebuilding the global economy. Today, focusing on the critical area of the role of the U.S. State Department and U.S. foreign policy overall. We have seen the costs when a U.S. administration engages in short-sighted, unilateralist, and non-evidence-based foreign policy, and when they use economics to justify strange positions or use bad economics to do so. Our aspiration today is to give advice to the new administration, particularly the Undersecretary for Economic and Energy Affairs, the two assistant secretaries reporting to that person, who are yet to be named, and obviously to the incoming nominated Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, as the U.S. moves forward and uses foreign policy, we hope, in a way that is constructive for the world as well as for its own people. We are very fortunate today to have with us three of my close colleagues from the Peterson Institute: Marcus Noland, our Executive Vice President, Director of Studies; Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow at the Institute; and Cullen Hendrix, non-resident Senior Fellow, definitely Senior Fellow, non-resident Senior Fellow and Director of various programs at the C Center at the Corbel School, Director of Sustainability Initiatives at the Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. I will give them a more proper introduction shortly. This is all on the record. And we encourage those of you who've registered through us on Zoom to pose questions for the second half of the program through the Q&A function on Zoom. I will gather them and give them to our colleagues at that time. Just briefly, a word about the Rebuilding the Global Economy project. For nearly 60, 70 years, global prosperity, global peace, and global economic integration went largely together. There were obviously effects of each that did not have fully wonderful effects for everyone, but in general, we saw a world in which these forces, these trends, were reinforcing each other, in part through actions of the US, in part through underlying economic logic, and in part through a series of specific policy decisions made by officials throughout the world. For arguably the last 10 to 15 years, these trends have gone into reverse, and whether or not it was the reversal of economic integration or the reversal of economic performance that caused one or the other, they have mutually reinforced their retreat. And so the world economy has to be rebuilt in a way that provides sustainable, well-distributed, environmentally sound economic growth that serves the people of the world. And we believe that common approach, cooperative solutions can be found to do that. More pressingly and perhaps less optimistically, but more feet to the fire, existential threats, genuinely meaning the word existential, such as abrupt climate change, pandemics, collapses in productivity growth, mass unemployment, and political destabilization, are part of the world we face and officials, including at the US State Department, face. And economic cooperation internationally is required in order to address these existential threats. And it is in that spirit we've chosen the word rebuilding the global economy, because it is not about some architectural fantasy of a Taj Mahal of global integration, but it is about a proper assessment of the ways in which the building we all live in, the economy, is no longer fit for purpose. It's not large enough for some members of the human family. It's not accessible enough, just like ADA had to make buildings accessible to people of different needs. And it is not fit to withstand all the storms that we are now facing. But it is possible to rebuild. My colleagues at the Peterson Institute and some of our board members have come together in this series of outings and series of memos. We're coming to the end of a series of memos to the new US administration, and we'll be talking to memos and advice to the European officials and officials at international institutions. This is not because we think the US and Europe are the only ones to set the agenda. Far from it. This is the opposite, that we believe there are many voices who need to be at the table, and we at the Peterson Institute can only speak directly to and give advice to, unbidden, those institutions and those nations from which our background stems. where our experience is. And we look forward in the coming weeks to not only eliciting comments and response from around the world and different interests into what we advise the US government, but having people from other countries, other interest groups, other parts of the world in terms of academia versus private sector versus other forms of study to help inform this pursuit. But at its core, we are trying to create a set of to-dos for incoming policymakers and current policymakers around the world to rebuild the global economy, not accepting the status quo, but doing things that practically can make a difference. It's a renovation project. It may be a gut renovation, but we have to live in this building and we're going to make the renovation work. And in that spirit, I'm really thrilled to have with me today Cullen, Mark, Jeff, and Catherine, who are all people who've worked at that practical level, both in research and in policy practice and advice. So let me introduce them properly as we go ahead to give advice and discussion of the role of the U.S. Department of State. First to speak will be Marcus Noland, my close colleague, who is Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Peterson Institute. He's been associated with the Institute since 1985. From 2009 to 12, he served as the Institute's Deputy Director. In the past, he's written extensively on the economies of Japan, Korea, and China, including his award-winning book, Avoiding the Apocalypse, The Future of the Two Koreas. He is unique among American economists and widely sought after in the security studies world and in national security government officials for his expertise on the problems of North Korea. In his most recent book, Hard Targets, Sanctions, Inducements, in the case of North Korea, co-authored with Stephen Haggard, addresses some of the most critical issues that a State Department in the US today has to face. Speaking second will be Cullen Hendrix. As already mentioned, Cullen, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, is a professor and director of sustainability initiatives at the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. His list of publications, which includes in Nature Climate Change, the Review of International Organizations, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, the Journal of Peace Research, spans a huge set of issues, but primarily on the intersection between conflict, environmental change, the management of agriculture, management of natural resources, and peace studies. And thus he is right on the cusp of some of the most important issues of the day, empirically dealing with these questions. He has been affiliated with the Peterson Institute for nearly a decade now, and he's been a consultant to the US Department of Defense, the World Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Food Program, among others. Speaking third is my colleague, Jeff Schott. Jeff is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, and he predates even Mark and me, having joined the Institute in 1983. He is legendary as an expert on trade negotiations and free trade agreements, having served in the US Treasury working on the Tokyo round and working at the Treasury from 1974 to 82. He's a member of the State Department's Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy and previously co-chaired the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee for the US Trade Representative. Jeff is one of the world's leading experts on the use and abuse of economic sanctions, having done groundbreaking work with our colleagues Gary Huffbauer and Kim Elliott. Jeff has also been the leader of our work studying the Chorus and the CPTPP, and was part of the kitchen cabinet advising then USTR Robert Zoellick and then WTO head Pascal Lamy, and continues a very active life in the trade negotiations world. Finally, independent of the Peterson Institute, but a valued colleague and friend, is Catherine Novelli, the Honorable Catherine Novelli, who is president of Listening for America, a nonpartisan organization working on US international trade engagement. Most relevantly for today, she served as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment from 2014 to 2017, reporting directly to the Secretary. She led the State Department's efforts to develop and implement economic growth, energy, ocean, environmental, science, and technology policies to address global challenges and to promote economic prosperity. She was also the State Department's Senior Coordinator for International Information Technology Diplomacy. She serves on the board of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. In addition to her global role, she launched the Global Connect initiative while Undersecretary, an innovative partnership with governments, multilateral development banks, and the private sector to connect 1.5 billion people to the internet. She spearheaded the first of its kind, Our Ocean Movement, which during her tenure resulted in $10 billion of grants for ocean conservation from governments, private sector, and philanthropy. This is the top line of an incredibly distinguished career, but is obviously makes her the perfect person to pull together the themes today that we want to pursue. So thank you all very much. Thank you for your patience with my long introductions. Let us now, in that order, Mark, Cullen, Jeff, Kathy, go ahead. Mark.
Thank you. It is an honor to participate in this meeting. The State Department has line responsibility for a number of international economic policies and influences U.S. policies on a much broader range of international economic policies through its participation in interagency process, bringing to bear a highly trained staff and a network of embassies around the world. In doing so, it often shares the lead on specific initiatives or negotiations with other cabinet departments which have in areas of specific functional expertise. Starting in January, the highest priority of the incoming Undersecretary of State will be to reinvigorate U.S. participation in bilateral, multilateral, plurilateral, regional alliances to further U.S. economic interests around the world. What I will do is identify some high priorities. Jeff and Cullen will elaborate in much greater detail on some of these issues, and then Kathy Novelli, who has actually held the job, will school us all. So what are those priorities? The first priority is fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of the policies that need to be undertaken with respect to the pandemic are public health policies that can be undertaken domestically. But the global nature of the pandemic necessitates an international multifaceted solution. None of us will truly be safe until everyone is safe. And in recent weeks, hopes have been buoyed by the development of several new vaccines that hold promise. The issue we face now is what I would call an emerging vaccine famine. In famines, people don't die because there's not enough food to go around in a physical sense. People die because they're poor and they do not command the resources in the marketplace to access adequate supplies of food. Initially, the production of those vaccines is going to be in a limited number of countries, and there's fear that the governments of those countries will engage in vaccine nationalism, restricting the export of those vaccines. And already we have rich governments around the world engaging in preemptive purchases of large amounts of vaccines. The demanding logistics of distribution of some of these vaccines will be another challenge. So what we need is a transparent, enforceable international agreement to produce and distribute the vaccines on a rational and equitable basis. Such an agreement is most likely to be achieved by the United States government working through international organizations such as the World Health Organization. The World Trade Organization will have a role to play in constraining vaccine nationalism and promoting what my colleague Chad Bown has described as trade facilitation on steroids. The COVAX partnership, multilateral development banks like the World Bank and the regional development banks will have roles to play in financing. For the US, the place to start is annulling the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the WTO. Recent surveys done by the Pew Research Organization, the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, and the Eurasia Group indicate that Americans support the WHO and international cooperation to end the pandemic. Doing the right thing is often politically problematic. This is a case where the right policy is actually politically popular as well. If the pandemic is the immediate challenge, then the longer-term existential challenge is global warming. As in the case of the pandemic, many of the policies that need to be undertaken are domestic policies not under the purview of the State Department. But global warming can only be solved and the US and other economies' domestic commitments sustained through cooperative interstate action. The Paris Agreement in the UN system is really the only game in town, and under the Trump administration, the US withdrawal from that agreement while other governments such as China and Japan were actually entering into commitments on carbon neutrality, greatly damaged US credibility abroad, disincentivized reforms here within the United States, and made reducing global carbon emissions more difficult. President-elect Biden has promised to get us back into the Paris Accord, but more work remains to be done, and the accord should be regarded as a stepping stone and not a final outcome. The Undersecretary's key responsibility will be to diplomatically manage the inevitable imposition of border taxes that various countries around the world implement to try to level the playing field between domestic and foreign producers as different countries pursue different abatement strategies on different timetables. It will be particularly important for the United States because we are likely to pursue a more gradual adjustment path than others, and hence US producers are likely to be affected by the imposition of those taxes. As in the case of the pandemic, the good news is participating in the Paris Agreement and cooperative solutions is politically popular. And the Biden administration is going to need to draw on that popularity in trying to achieve a positive outcome. A third priority will be joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trump administration abandoned the TPP negotiations in 2017, and when it did so, the other 11 countries moved on without us, forming CPTPP. More recently, 15 Asian countries, including China, have formed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. The United States has essentially taken itself out of the game in the world's most dynamic part of the world economy, leaving itself isolated and falling behind. The State Department is going to need to work with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to explore U.S. accession to CPTPP. Ironically, when the U.S. dropped out of those negotiations, the other countries dropped some of the provisions that had been politically controversial here in the United States. So the final outcome of those negotiations, the CPTPP, may actually be more palatable to Congress than what had been being proposed in 2017. And Jeff will have more to say about this. It is not going to be politically easy for the Biden administration to embrace this, but remaining outside creates an opening for China to play the role of writing the rules regionally, which may well be broadened globally, as well as encouraging conventional trade diversion away from the United States. That brings me to a fourth priority, revitalizing the U.S.-China dialogue. The U.S.-China is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and every administration since at least the Clinton administration has had a high-level economic dialogue with China. The Trump administration's Phase 1 deal, which emphasized targeting bilateral balances, was fundamentally misguided. Moreover, the need by the Chinese to manage trade in order to try to achieve those targets, which actually aren't being met anyway, has required greater involvement of the Chinese state and the Communist Party in the Chinese economy, which is the opposite of what we want to see. The United States does have real problems with China, things like intellectual property rights, things like industrial subsidies, but the existing approach targeting bilateral balances doesn't address them. The United States, the Undersecretary needs to revitalize that process, get rid of the focus on bilateral balances, address the problems that really matter, which will also open up the opportunity to cooperate with China on things in which we can cooperate: cybersecurity, North Korea, climate change, and so on. Finally, combating corruption. And Lily, if you can move to the summary slide. Traditionally, the United States has led the world in anti-corruption transparency actions, pioneering the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which bars bribery by U.S. firms abroad. Extending that work at the global level is not only good for economic efficiency, but it levels the playing field for U.S. firms competing abroad. In 2017, the U.S. withdrew from the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, an international agreement to reduce corruption and bring improved management to resource extractive industries such as oil and mining, where problems in developing countries have been endemic. These problems are not just economic concerns, but by encouraging political instability in these natural resource producers represents a national security challenge as well. The State Department needs to work with the Department of Interior to get the United States back into EITI. Similarly, the Undersecretary should work with his or her counterpart at the Department of Justice to communicate to foreign counterparts that the United States stands fully behind the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and similar anti-corruption efforts through the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. In normal times, any of these priorities would absorb the lion's share of the Undersecretary's attention. The incoming Undersecretary will have to take them all on in pretty short order. I look forward to Jeff and Cullen further elaborating the international economic policy agenda facing the State Department, and then Kathy explaining it all to us from the standpoint of someone who's actually done the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I think I've reversed the order a couple times, but maybe we could start with Cullen and then go to Jeff. So Cullen, please.
Thank you, Mark. A lot of the points that I'm going to be making are consonant with what you've heard already, but hopefully I can help flesh out some of these ideas in a bit greater detail. For the next administration to help rebuild the global economy, it will need to rebuild the U.S. reputation and position of leadership in global environmental governance. This is both because protecting the environment and avoiding or better managing environmental conflicts are good things in and of themselves, but also because doing so is going to help spur economic development, both at home and abroad. And I'll outline 4 main areas where I believe the Biden administration can look to move the ball forward. The first is on climate change. In 2019, the Trump administration formally announced the United States would withdraw from the 2015 Paris Agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This withdrawal, as Mark noted, badly damaged the United States soft power abroad and actively discouraged the transition to renewable energy systems at home and job creation and export potential that would come therewith. With ambitious decarbonization targets and financial commitments by the European Union and China, it's very clear that the global train is leaving the station. Now, the United States can either be on that train and get involved in decarbonizing its energy systems and spurring investment in innovation in green technology and leveraging our world-leading position in technological innovation, or we can sit on the sidelines and miss that opportunity. President-elect Biden has already promised to rejoin the Paris Agreement, but that promise will need to be backstopped by concrete actions to catch up on the United States' own nationally determined contributions to meeting emissions targets and help developing and middle-income economies meet their targets through technical assistance, technology transfer, and clean energy financing. The second broad area is clearly related to the first, achieving sustainable energy security. U.S. hydrocarbon-based energy systems are not secure unless we define security in an extremely narrow way. The shale revolution has the United States heading towards energy independence and being a net exporter of oil and natural gas. But energy independence is not the same thing as energy security or energy autonomy, especially if the emissions those energy systems create contribute to damaging wildfires, crop-harming droughts, and localized pollution and adverse health effects for Americans. And that's just thinking about the domestic effects. Our choices about energy systems have second-order effects for choices made across the globe. Sticking with oil and gas at home will confer continued leverage on other major hydrocarbon producers and exporters, and many of them, like Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, are not always benign actors. So moving forward on this is more of a domestic than international initiative, as Mark highlighted, but it could be helped in the international arena in 4 concrete ways. The first is going to be, I think, pressing for decarbonization targets as an element of future trade negotiations. The United States should add successful progress toward nationally determined contribution targets as an element of these negotiations, using access to the U.S. market as a carrot to help induce sustainable transitions in our trading partners. The second would be promotion of carbon border tax adjustments on energy consumption's contribution to imported goods and services. Mark also mentioned this briefly. Broader carbon taxes, especially those that are progressive or graduated by partner income level, may generate something of a race to the bottom dynamic to concentrate carbon-intensive production methods in developing countries, thereby discouraging their carbon leapfrogging in their energy systems. And by imposing taxes on the carbon intensity of the energy component of finished products or services, we can hopefully address some of the pernicious or perverse incentives that would be created by such a mechanism, and also provide increased climate change adaptation financing. The third is more deeply integrating the North American electricity grid. The grids of Canada, the United States, and Mexico are only lightly integrated, despite each of those countries having vast renewable potential, and for somewhat different reasons in different countries. The State Department should press regional partners to increase two-way energy trade and integration, and in particular encourage the Lopez Obrador administration to reinstate some energy market liberalizations in Mexico that would be necessary to kind of catalyze the private investment needed to enhance grid integration. The fourth is, as Mark also said, to reinvigorate U.S. participation in EITI, or the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. This is a really groundbreaking multi-stakeholder initiative to prevent corruption, conflict, human rights violations, and environmental degradation while promoting good governance in extractive industries. And the Trump administration backed away from this initiative in 2017 and also backed away from previous commitments to help developing and lower income countries like Myanmar with technical assistance in achieving the commitments that they had made under EITI. Rededicating the US government to EITI rhetorically will be a good first step. Many US-based companies decided to stay in EITI regardless of the actions of the government. But it will need to go further, and I think press for increasing transparency, not just in kind of the traditional hydrocarbons and extractives that Mark mentioned, but trade of 35 critical minerals identified by the U.S. Geological Survey in 2018. These minerals are going to be key to sustaining energy transitions, to say nothing of U.S. national security priorities and force readiness. So helping to ensure governance around them or good governance around them, will provide broad economic, social, and political benefits. The third issue area is reasserting U.S. leadership in the maritime domain. Maritime issues tend to be framed often as either environmental or security issues, but the oceans are a massive economy in their own right. So just in the United States and the European Union, the blue economy contributed over $1 trillion in gross domestic product in 2018. The global value is perhaps closer to $2.5 trillion, which doesn't even count the literally priceless ecosystem services our global oceans provide in terms of food, energy, ease of transshipment, and weather and climate regulation at the global and regional scales. Now, reasserting leadership does not just mean reinvesting in naval capacity, which the United States is doing. It means investing in multilateral ocean governance initiatives. I'll highlight two. The first is pushing Congress to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Ratifying UNCLOS would give the United States legal precedent to pursue claims on the U.S. continental shelf and establish or prevent the establishment of legal precedents that might harm the competitiveness of U.S. firms and preclude investment in U.S. maritime territory. It would also signal a real emphasis on upholding a rules-based international order and give the United States standing to participate more directly in critical maritime dispute resolution processes, like those affecting territorial claims in the South China Sea. To be blunt, the last 4 years have been incredibly damaging to the United States' credibility. So working within existing institutional frameworks can help to rebuild that. The standard U.S. position on the law of the sea, that it will generally act as if it is enforced, but not actually accede to it, is only as credible as U.S. commitments to allies and partners, and that credibility has been badly strained. The second is to encourage friends and allies to strengthen the Port State Measures Agreement. It's the first binding agreement to combat illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU fishing. IUU fishing contributes to marine piracy, narcotic smuggling, and human trafficking, but it also undermines the sustainability of capture fisheries that provide food, income, and export revenue for the United States. The State Department should, in partnership with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, press more trading and security partners to join the agreement and help ensure sustainable, viable ocean fisheries moving forward. Finally, I would like to briefly mention an initiative that would be more important, I think, from a national security perspective, but that nevertheless has implications for U.S. allies and trading partners, and that is environmental drivers of state fragility. As the key agency responsible for implementing the Global Fragility Act of 2019, the State Department is tasked with advancing diplomatic and political efforts, drafting and executing strategy implementation, and guiding security efforts to address the root causes of violence and fragility abroad. While these efforts are headed by the State Department's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, the increasing role of environmental factors in armed conflicts and the specter of even larger impacts under climate change implies a need to integrate concerns related to energy, agriculture, and the environment into efforts to build partner country resilience. For this reason, State Department fragility assessment should be required to assess environmental security threats, both those emanating from the first order effects of changes in the natural environment and those emanating from the second order effects of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation related efforts. The United States has spent the last administration on the sidelines of global environmental governance, to the United States' economic and environmental detriment. Hopefully, these ideas would help put the United States back in the game in a very major way. Thank you, and back to you, Adam.
Thank you, Cullen, for the very specific suggestions reflecting your expertise and the criticality of these issues. But we need to not lose sight of the core role of the State Department in more traditional trade and commerce issues as part of the global context of soft power and U.S. role that we've already spoken about. And to that, I ask Jeff Schott to speak.
Thank you, Adam. And it's a pleasure to join this very distinguished panel with great expertise. And what I'm going to say builds on what Marcus and Cullen have already said. They've noted that the U.S. has withdrawn from a number of international initiatives over the past 4 years, and it's time for the U.S. to get back in the game, as Cullen just said, and lead international initiatives on trade, climate, and health. Mark noted that we need to advance new initiatives that improve and better coordinate international actions against global warming and the COVID-19 pandemic. And we need to support the WTO initiatives that facilitate the distribution of medicines and equipment needed to fight the pandemic. But to do so, we need to rebuild the frayed economic relations with our own allies in Europe and Asia in particular that have been neglected over the past 4 years. U.S. credibility as a reliable partner has been shaken by protectionist measures against our own allies that have been taken for dubious national security reasons and in response to demands to rebalance and restructure bilateral trade pacts, and as an unintended consequence of some of our actions on economic sanctions against target countries in Asia and the Middle East. We need to resolve these internecine trade disputes that create mistrust and hinder cooperative efforts. That's a primary responsibility of the State Department. We need to coordinate our sanctions policies to make them more effective and less disruptive for trade and investment between the United States and our allies. Often we shoot at our target countries, and the measures we impose primarily hit the trade and investment of U.S. firms and those of our partner countries. And we need to break the impasse over WTO leadership, which the current administration is now blocking, and to resolve the longstanding dispute over how the WTO resolves disputes. A critical part of international diplomacy where the State Department has to take the lead. The third priority, as Mark noted, is re-engaging in the Asia Pacific. And what's required, I believe, is a renegotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the U.S. withdrew from almost 4 years ago. The TPP was never popular, but it has never been more needed than today. During the past 4 years, China's influence in the region has grown while the U.S. ties with key allies have frayed. The U.S. needs to upgrade the deal for both substantive reasons and to ensure domestic political support that was lacking 4 years ago. And it needs to draw on the experience that we've had in renegotiating our trade relations with our North American partners in the USMCA, building on the what I would call the TPP plus chapters on labor and environment and digital trade, on currency, and on dealing with data localization that is so important in the financial services sectors. Plus, and importantly, I think what is lacking and what was omitted by both the Obama and Trump administration was a focus on trade and climate change. And a revised and renegotiated Asia-Pacific Pact should add a new chapter on trade and climate change, which could become the hallmark of the new Biden administration. The fourth priority is related to that. And one of our allies in the region, Taiwan, has been isolated by the wide range of economic integration arrangements that have been promulgated over the past few years. Taiwan, we need to support Taiwan's accession to counter its isolation from Asia-Pacific supply chains due to the RCEP and other inter-Asian trade pacts. I think such a relationship in which the United States is involved in a regional pact is preferable to a bilateral free trade agreement with Taiwan, which has been called for by a number of senators in recent days. And either way, we're going to inflame U.S.-China relations, but I think a participation by Taiwan in a regional arrangement would be more tolerable and more supportive of U.S. and Taiwanese interests and the alliance between the two of us. Finally, I think it's important to focus on a big issue that's been in the news just most recently, and that is the situation in Iran and its continued development of nuclear weapons and missile delivery systems. The United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and it needs to get back into the game because in the intervening 4 years, Iran, even though it has suffered tremendously because of U.S. sanctions, has also continued to develop and come closer to the point where it has the ability to produce nuclear weapons. We need to join with our allies in this, and this is where the points I raised before are so important, that we need to work with our allies and also work with China. And this is one of the areas, as Mark said, where we will have to find a pragmatic way of opposing things that we dislike with China, but still being able to work with China in areas where we share common concerns. And certainly the spread of nuclear weapons in the Middle East is a concern to both the United States and China and many other countries. We need to tighten, we need to update and improve the terms of the previous pact, not just go back to the old regime. Tightening controls on weapons development and missile systems in return for sanctions relief. Here again, we need a common front with our allies to get Iran to accept new and more comprehensive controls. So that is going to be a much more difficult international initiative because of the recent assassination in Tehran of a senior Iranian nuclear expert. But it's one where we need to work closely and find a way to put the cork back in the bottle before the situation gets out of hand. And here the State Department has important responsibilities. So in summation, I think we have the key priorities, but they all focus on working more closely together with our allies. We cannot have America alone anymore. We need America in the lead, but with the support and cooperation and coordination of our key allies. We need to reinforce relations with them, rebuild it, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, and focus on containing the growing problem in the Middle East caused by the continued growth of the development of Iran's nuclear weapons. All key problems and big challenges for the State Department. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. We're about to turn to Kathy Novelli for her perspective, having served with distinction as the Undersecretary of State. I would just remind everyone that for those of you who registered ahead of time, roughly 200 of you, please do post questions using the Zoom Q&A function. We will start posing those to our panelists immediately following Catherine's remarks. Kathy.
Thanks so much, Adam, and thanks to PIIE for letting me be on this panel, and to all of my fellow panelists who have had excellent, I think, points. I just wanted to emphasize a couple things and add a few things to all the excellent points that have been made. And picking up on where Jeff left off, I completely agree that we need to think about how we have an ally-based approach to all of the issues that are under the purview of the the Undersecretary of State's office. And I think we need to look at allies in two ways. One is traditional with a capital A, our allies that we all know, the Five Eyes, NATO, et cetera. But I also think we need to look at it with a small a, and that is to look at where we can find alliances on issue-based places, maybe with countries who we haven't paid so much attention to, like in Africa or elsewhere, and to try to form a more comprehensive approach to some of these seminal problems that we are facing. At the same time that we're looking externally, I think one of the things that has been really neglected at the State Department, whose focus has been mainly external, is looking internally and communicating internally about what we're doing. Obviously, there's lots of communication inside the Beltway, but outside the Beltway, not so much. And I would use as an example of that the TPP, which Jeff already said was not popular. And one of my jobs was to go around the country talking to people about it during the Obama administration. And I traveled in the Midwest in particular, and I just found, you were right, people didn't support it, but also the reasons why they didn't support it were because they had a completely different idea about what it actually was. And I think, by not communicating, you cede the floor to people who want to generate conspiracies or other things. And we cannot proceed on anything that we do internationally without domestic public support. So I would make that as a very important point. The other thing that I would say is, and I think the thread that ran through all of the three presentations, is that we need to look comprehensively at what we're doing and not look in silos. So not just the economic silo by itself, or the environment silo by itself, or the energy silo by itself, but how do these things actually mutually reinforce each other? And one of the things that I think is going to be very important, and one of the things that I saw a lot as Undersecretary, is that, we, because we have to reassert credibility, I think it'll be very important that we not just say, because we say so, you should do this. I think it'll be very important that when we're making our points about what we think should happen, that they're based on facts and evidence that can stand on their own. And there's two little known offices in the Undersecretary's office that are crucial to this. One is the chief economist of the State Department, and the other one is the science advisor. And both of those really should be tasked to help provide the underpinnings for the things that we are making, and not just to provide the underpinnings for what the diplomats are making, but also to themselves form networks. And that was started when I was there. It was not continued, but I think it's very important to continue this, to actually reach out and have science advisor engagement across foreign ministries, have chief economist engagement, because we want that same kind of fact-based approach to be prevalent in other countries too. And I think it makes the dialogue so much easier. Just a few other points. One is, the other thing that I think is not known is, the points that Mark made about COVID. There's actually a whole health office in the office of the Undersecretary that worked very closely on Ebola and other issues, and SARS, et cetera. And so I think that office needs to really be brought to the fore. They are professionals who know what they're doing and know how to engage with their counterparts. I think, as Mark said, it's very important that we look at this in a whole of U.S. government, but whole of world kind of approach. The other thing I would say is, we've stepped back from the development agenda that almost every other administration has had. I think that is a very important agenda. I think it's very important in building the small A allies, and also in achieving the goals we want to achieve. As countries may say, well, we're with you, but we don't have the resources. And so trying to get help to get everybody not just on the same page, but implementing those things, I think is very, very important. And that means we have to integrate what AID is doing and our other development agencies very closely with our foreign policy, our international economic policy. As well, I think it's very important that we think about that when we're engaging with the development banks. So issues like how do we promote sustainable infrastructure development, and how are their environmental reviews with these major funders like the World Bank or even the AIIB, the Chinese bank. How do we think about things like internet connectivity, which the World Bank has estimated a 10% increase in internet connectivity in a developing country actually raises GDP by 1 to 2 percentage points. So the best development tool we can think of. So how do we work on those things, not just with the US by itself, but the US through those who have money that they can bring to the table? I think those are some very important practical things. I fully agree that we have to engage in Asia. I fully agree that the relationship with China is very important. I think there are places where we can really cooperate with China. We would never have gotten the Paris Agreement without us working together with China, and China wants to cooperate on environment. I think that gives us a great opening. We also had a budding dialogue, and we need to continue that on transportation issues, where again, the Undersecretary's office leads internationally, conservation. And I think we also led the dialogue with the NDRC, which is China's kind of central planner, which was a very important window into thinking of the future. And it gave us a nice in to make our points and form relationships, which we need to do. Clearly, some of the fraught trade issues are going to continue to be fraught, but that doesn't mean we avoid them. We're going to have to confront them. And issues like steel, et cetera, commodities, access to the Chinese market, intellectual property. I fully agree, though, that trying to do it by ourselves has not been hugely successful in actually affecting change. And that's where we really need to work with other countries, particularly with Europe, but also our other traditional allies. One of the things that needs to be at the top of the list when the new administration comes in is how we're going to work with the EU on privacy, because the privacy shield that we had negotiated that allows data to move between the US and EU was struck down. And that is huge for business to be able to operate cross borders. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to deal with that. As well, I think the intersection between environment and trade is something that we all have to come to grips with. We have to come to grips with it with respect to how trade traditionally has not been terribly sympathetic to environmental treaties. Cullen, you raised the Port State Measures Agreement, which is a fantastic agreement, which we got the Congress to agree to implementing legislation for. But yet, the WTO doesn't even recognize that as a legitimate, and the activities taken under it as legitimate. So I think we have got to forge a way for the WTO to be much more environmentally recognizing legitimate agreements that are reached. And the fact that they might have trade consequences does not mean that they're violating the WTO. And we have to think about that, I think, integrating it in our own government policy, because, Adam, as you said, that is an existential threat to the globe. And we cannot just put it off on one side and have only one kind of group of people dealing with that. Similarly, and following on that, the whole question of sustainability and energy, I think, are going to be key, and how we work on that, both from a policy standpoint and issue standpoint, but also how we engage in a way that helps countries take those practical steps that are going to actually make change. Because people can sign pieces of paper, but if they don't actually do the thing, the piece of paper is nice, but it's not making change. And that's what I think we have to look at. So those are just some points to add on to the excellent ones that have already been made. And I will look forward to questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I want to waste nobody's time, including our patient audience, and we have a number of great questions. Gathering some questions on a common theme from Naomi Freeman, Marco Pignon, and Kathleen Stevenson. What is realistically, this goes with your last point, there for the State Department to do in a divided US government where we can't get any treaties through the Senate, presumably at least through 2022 elections. And also where countries have been burnt by the whipsawing of US policy with alternating presidents. How does one cope with those realities, that there is a deficit potentially of trust from others and a deficit of ability to deliver over the next 2 years? Let me ask Kathy and then Mark to address, and then I'll turn to some questions for the others, please.
Well, I think that is a serious issue, and we're going to have to work our way through it. I guess I would go back to the point I made in the beginning, which is, to the extent that we're able to make fact-based, evidence-based arguments for what we're doing, I think that helps us a lot. To the extent that we're able to communicate what we're doing, not just inside the Beltway, but outside, I think that helps us a lot with the Congress as well. I do think that there is going to be some wariness by other countries about what we're doing. So I think we have to think about things that we're putting forward that can stand on their own, and that are good for us, that we want to happen, but that we can demonstrate are good for others for their own reasons and not just because we say so.
Thank you. Marcus?
Great question. And it is going to be a tough situation if Republicans control the Senate and decide to act in an obstructionist manner. There's a certain amount of stuff you can do through executive order, though I think that's a very unfortunate way to govern. But one of the reasons I mentioned the public opinion data when I on the first two priorities, the pandemic and climate change, is the public is actually behind cooperative action. There is a vocal minority that opposes. And so one of the things the president will need to do is rally that public opinion to put some pressure on the Congress to act in a more cooperative manner. The third priority I mentioned was getting back into CPTPP. That's not something natural for the Biden administration to do, but I think I could make an argument, and I'm not doctrinaire about this, that we need to get involved with Asia. That is the obvious entry point. That will help establish credibility with our partners because we're meeting them where they actually are, not where we want them to be. And it is an issue where you actually might get bipartisan support in the Congress. Though it would be a politically difficult thing for the Biden administration to do, no doubt about that.
Really interesting last point there, Mark. Thank you very much. I know Jeff and Cullen could comment on the broader issue, but let me try to get in some more questions. So turning to Jeff Schott, we have an interesting question from James Lockett that the Trump administration opened a Pandora's box by its use of national security as a foundation for various trade actions. It opens an almost limitless number of WTO exception-based actions that are difficult to challenge, or at least this is what Mr. Lockett raises. Potentially, some people would see border taxes on carbon as having a similar but different prospect for abuse by WTO members. What kinds of disciplines do you think, Jeff, the U.S. should be advocating to put in place on border taxes for carbon and dealing with national security exceptions?
Well, the national security issue is a very difficult one because no country is going to accept constraints on its ability to act in defense of its own national security. And there have been very few instances up until the Trump administration where countries actually invoke national security exceptions in international agreements. This became the norm rather than the exception in the last few years. And it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. If there are some guidelines or notification requirements or consultation requirements before decisions are taken, that would be helpful. But national security is going to be difficult, and it is going to have to be constrained based on the self-interest of the United States in deepening relations with our allies and regaining the trust that we used to have. I think Kathy's point was very important on that. On climate, we need to work together with our allies to find what is the common approach that should be in an important new chapter on trade and climate change. This can involve encouraging the development and distribution of renewable energy resources, banning fossil fuel subsidies, but albeit with some income support for the poorest countries that will be affected. R&D subsidies that would promote new technologies that are climate friendly. The WTO had that in its first 5 years, and those provisions expired. Those types of things can be developed if there's a need and an interest and leadership by the United States, which I think would find great support in Europe and in China as well.
Thank you, Jeff. Turning now to Cullen, there have been a number of questions about not just Belt and Road, but Law of the Seas area and energy expansion with grid from China. I think all four of our speakers did a good job in saying how central China is to US foreign policy, but not making everything judged by how it affects US-China. But given that some of these issues, Cullen, you've written on, what should we be doing about maritime resource conflicts in the ocean areas around China? How should we be handling China's aggressive, in part positive, in part negative approach to build energy infrastructure in the region? Where do you see that?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. There's a lot in that question. I'll try and be brief in my response. I think that the first part is just to adopt, I would not say an agnostic kind of attitude, but a more measured kind of position vis-a-vis some of these actions by China, especially with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative, and then also to its expansion of its own energy grid, but a deeper desire to integrate its energy grid with the energy grids of Southeast Asia and Central Asia to a certain extent, because not all of these things are net negative for US interests. So first off, I think that is something that we need to acknowledge, and we need to be realistic about the fact that the United States has for a long time held that we need to promote essentially basic infrastructural investment in developing and middle income countries. Now, we might prefer that financing were coming from another source, or that we're coming through different vehicles, maybe from a Paris Club lender, so that there would be a little bit more equity in terms of addressing how those things are repaid. But I think at first approximation, we should just not view these things as unalloyed negatives. The second part of it is that this is the broader response to the issues in the South China Sea, I think, is going to require, unfortunately, a mixture of soft power operating through some of these institutions that we've discussed, but also a redeployment or repositioning of U.S. hard power. And so one of the ideas that has been put on the table there is whether or not these kind of provocations would necessitate, or at least put on the table, a repositioning of more of our naval assets in forward bases in Japan and the Philippines. Now, that act would obviously be seen, I think, as provocative, but would also have the effect of establishing a much more kind of credible presence for deterrent purposes than many of the strategies that have been, I think, a little bit more ad hoc and primarily driven by third-party engagement by our allies, either via their coast guards or navies. So those are just some initial responses, and I think I'm probably out of time. But yeah, it's a very complex question and issue.
Thank you all. You've been wonderfully concise. We're going to run over by 2-3 minutes because I'm going to go to Kathy for one last question. This sounds like a very inside baseball question, but it's actually very practical for a transition team, about how you organize and how you deal with interagency issues. And you talked about this some in your remarks, and Mark and others touched upon it. In particular, you raised the issue of the chief economist, the science advisor in the State Department, and Naomi Freeman and Melissa Sanderson on the Q&A raised questions about how should that be coordinated with their counterparts in other departments around the federal government, and should there be some kind of specific White House strategic coordination, or how do you make this work? And of course, you've lived through these interagency processes. So for the new transition team, what would you recommend?
Well, I do think it's important that the chief economists in all of the different departments that touch on international things and not international things coordinate with each other. We did a very successful project of that on some transportation issues that we had in the Middle East, and it was because we had the lead. Our chief economist took the lead in coordinating among everybody from Justice Department to transportation to USTR, et cetera. And that produced, again, that underpinning that allowed us to figure out, how we should head. So I guess what I would say is I don't know that we need to have a specific White House process, because those can kind of get bogged down, but perhaps there is a little bit more decentralized process where whichever agency has the lead on any given thing, it is a given that the chief economists of all the other agencies involved are going to work together. And I think that works very, very well without it putting in place a huge bureaucracy.
Terrific. Thank you, Kathy Novelli, former Undersecretary of State for Economic and Global Affairs. Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. Thank you to Marcus Noland, Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Peterson Institute. Thank you to Cullen Hendrix, non-resident Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute and Professor at the Korbel School of International Studies. And thank you to Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute. I would just tell people this is part of our ongoing series on rebuilding the global economy. This is our pivot point from advice to the incoming US administration to advice to international organizations. Starting with tomorrow, we will hold an event, a similar event on the role of the International Monetary Fund with contributions from Jose de Gregorio, Joseph Gagnon, Peter Orzag, and Kristen Forbes. The following week, we turn to the central banking issues with an event on the ECB and European macro policy with Olivier Blanchard, Jean Pisani-Ferry, Angel Ubide, and Lucretia Reichlin. And in 2 weeks' time, we have a discussion of international finance and the central banks, including climate change, with Mark Carney, Patrick Honohan, Olivier Jean, and Carolyn Atkinson. I hope all of you will either join us live and ask questions or look for the videos and transcripts and memos as posted on the Peterson Institute Rebuilding the Global Economy microsite. Again, thank you all very much. Thanks to our panelists. This meeting is adjourned.